To Read by Angelique. I am Angelique, and today I need to give a disclaimer because it's the morning, there's snow on the ground, I'm still drinking my coffee, we're almost finished the Phantom of the Opera, and my energy level is at a 10. I'm pretty thrilled about this day and about the book, about life, about everything. So I'm just want to make sure hey, you guys okay? You cool? Because I might be giving a lot. I don't know. It might not come off like that on a screen this way in the video, but there's a lot going on inside, okay? Anywho, I'm gonna just keep sipping my coffee as we read today, which is not gonna help my voice or my energy levels. Anywho, I will quit boring you with that. Let's do a recap because the last video we read chapters 12 and 13 and they were pretty wild. So we're still in the Persian's perspective. We're reading everything from his narrative, and Raoul and the Persian are stuck in this torture chamber, and they can hear the Phantom, they can hear Eric and Christine talking outside, and they're like, okay, we have to get Christine to come because they have no access outside of the torture chamber. They're stuck. And what they hear Eric talking to Christine about is essentially, he keeps on saying, you have to choose either the, Requiem for, you have to pick two different songs, the Wedding Mass or the Requiem Mass by the next night at 11 p.m. And basically her choice is either marry me or don't. If you don't, everyone dies. You die, I die, the whole world dies. And if you marry me, you will be thrilled with the life that we get to live. Essentially, he's like, we can sing forever together and die of singing, essentially. It would be our pleasure to die while singing to each other. I don't know, some music, I've been going hard the last 3 days. Something hit in the book where I'm just a full committed fan now. And so I have just been going hard on all of the different Phantom of the Opera albums, the London musical, the movie, Josh Groban, whoever has done a rendition of these songs, I've been listening to them. And so I'm like, you know what? I could see how you could just get in a trance, listen to this music, and then die. Maybe that's what they're talking about. I don't know. And then so they're in there, and by listening, they figure out that Christine is tied up. She has her hands tied. And they're like, oh no, this is not good. If her hands are tied, that's not good. And they're like, we have to get the ghost has to leave. Eric has to leave so that we can talk to Christine. Because if we can hear them through this wall, if we start talking, she can hear us. And eventually Eric does leave. There's a sound that it's like a doorbell, I think, but essentially the sirens in the lake go off, and so someone's on by in the water. Eric leaves Christine. So the Persian and Raoul take their moment. Raoul immediately is like, Christine, just this forlorn lover, desperate, and Christine's just over there. I'm dreaming. This can't be true. It's all in my head. Finally, they convince her that they're actually there. And she's like, what? I can't come and get you. There's only 2 doors here, one of which I've never been into. That must be the door that you're in. Please don't tell me that you are in the torture chamber. She's like, I don't know what it is. He's forbidden me to go there, but it can't be good, right? That's just a bad title for a room in your house. And they keep talking to her about making a plan. And she's like, I can't do anything. My hands are tied. And they're like, you have to. They were like, when he comes back, just use your charms, convince him that you love him somehow, and he will undo the binds on your arms. Tell him that he's hurting you and he'll stop. He really genuinely loves you. So just work your magic and get us out of here. Because he keeps 2 keys on his, like, in this case, I think it's on his, like, on the organ or on the piano where he plays. She's like, there's 2 keys in there, but he won't let me touch them. Like, I'm forbidden to touch them. And they're like, well, let us die then, you know, do it or don't. And then they're like, why are you tied up? And she's like, well, I tried to kill myself last night by bashing my head in on the wall. So she's tied up because Eric doesn't want her to commit suicide. And Raoul is like in severe agony now. He's like, no, like, my poor Christine. And it's pretty melodramatic, but I'm here for it. And so they keep talking, but then they hear steps and they're like, Eric's coming back. And he comes back and Christine's like, why are you wet? And he's like, well, it's raining cats and dogs outside. But if you remember, so the sirens went off, right? And we get a little bit of the information from the Persian's perspective, but he's like, it's raining cats and dogs. That's why I'm soaking wet. How did he get outside so fast and come back and whatever? And the Persian's like, no, he went into the lake. There's probably a dead guy out there. He just killed someone because the doorbell went off. He went out to the lake. He probably did his little submerged thing with the reed where you can breathe underwater, and he probably dragged that person underwater. He's either unconscious, dead, or harmed in somehow. And he had the audacity to tell Christine that it's raining cats and dogs. My goodness, this is ridiculous. He's a liar. And Christine is like, the opera ghost, he's literally going mad right now. Like, his mind is frayed. And at one point, Eric tells Christine, he's like, you know what, you wanted to commit suicide, and I'm actually kind of tired of living too. Let's just die together. I'm like, okay. But when he comes back, Christine does try to work her charms. And she's like, my wrists, they hurt, Eric, let me go. And he's like, no, you're gonna kill yourself. And she's like, no, I'm not. Like, you said you loved me and you're hurting me. So he lets her go. And he's like, your poor wrists, because they're red, because he tied them so tight. And then he goes to the piano to play. I think she asks him, like, she's trying to figure out how to inconspicuously go to the piano to grab the keys. And so she convinces him to play and goes over there with him. And then while he's playing, she must have snuck the keys, but it doesn't actually say that. All we get is Eric being like, where are my keys? He notices that they're gone. And Christine's like, oh, I was just curious about the torture chamber, you know, female curiosity. And Eric's like, no, you're lying. You're being ridiculous. And she just keeps going on like, I'm a curious female woman that's stupid sometimes. And he's like, I'm not falling for it. And then they kind of hear a voice. I think Raoul, probably, because he's a little bit stupid, makes a sound. And Eric's like, did you hear that? And she's like, I yelled because you frightened me. And he's like, you wanted to see in the torture chamber. You know, you don't have to actually go through the door to see it. You can see it just up there. I have this window. That's what these stairs leading up are for. And you know, the light inside automatically comes on if someone's in there. Isn't that fascinating? And so he pulls these drapes over this window that was hidden, and the light's on. And he's like, fancy that. The light's on. Someone must be in there. And he's like, Christine, let's go up and let's look at this. And she's like, no. Like, no one's in there. You know what? I'm actually not that curious anymore. It's fine. And he's like, okay, fine, I'll go. Like, I'll go check it out. And then she's like, stop it. Don't go up there. I'll do it. So she makes her way up the stairs, looks out this window, And it's like, no one's there. And then comes down and he's like, so what'd you see? Like, what'd you see? And she was fascinated because there's a forest inside this chamber, which I'm still trying to wrap my brain around. I might have to reread the chapter because I'm confused. And yeah, so he's like, yeah, a forest because, and he makes some excuses of why there's a forest in his torture chamber, which I don't really understand. He keeps asking her questions. He's like, how do you like the landscape? Oh, very much, because it's trees and whatnot. She's like, there's not actually tortures in here. Like, you scared me a lot. Why do you call this a torture chamber? And she starts kind of flattering him about how he designed the room, and then he just keeps asking questions. He's like, what did you see? A forest. What is in the forest? Trees. What is in the tree? Birds. Did you see any birds? And she's like, well, no, I didn't see any birds. Well, what did you see? Well, branches. And then he said, what is in a branch? And he said, there's a gibbet. And that's why I call my forest a torture chamber. And I don't get that. I should look up what a gibbet is. I should have done that earlier, but I didn't. Anywho, and then she's like, man, is it hot in here? It's getting really hot. And he's like, yeah, that's the forest. And like it's on fire or something weird. But then he starts bragging about himself and all of his different talents, because he talked about his talent of designing the forest, and he's like, actually, I am the world's finest ventriloquist. And he kind of cheekily lifts up his mask just to show his lips, and he shuts his lips and starts talking, and she can hear him, but his lips aren't moving. And then he starts like throwing his voice around the room. He talks in her left ear and then her right ear. He talks from box and he talks from this. And then he makes his voice into the torture chamber and is like talking to the Persian and to Raoul in there. And he's just like essentially going mad, but he can do this weird thing. It's very otherworldly. And Christine just starts going mad. She's like, stop it, you're driving me insane, because she's just hearing his voice go around and he's tormenting her. And then he's like, how do you think Carlotta made the frog sound in her throat? I spoke from her throat. And then he's like, how do you think the managers, the new like owners of the opera, heard my voice when I said that Madame Carlotta is singing tonight to bring the chandelier down? He's like, I said that. I said all of that. These are the amazing things I can do with my voice. And then she like gets consumed with how hot it is, and he's like, how could you not see that it was an African forest? I guess African forests are really hot. Maybe they burn. And now, like, Raoul and the Persian are going crazy inside the torture chamber. And that's where we ended last time. Like, that's the chapter that kind of, the last two chapters, like, that reading is what set me over the edge to be like, what in the, this is amazing and creepy, but also what? Anywho. Okay, chapter 14. Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 14. Barrels, barrels. The Persian's narrative continued. I have said that the room in which Monsieur le Vicomte de Cheny and I were imprisoned was a regular hexagon, lined throughout with mirrors. Plenty of these rooms have been seen since, mainly at exhibitions. They are called palaces of illusion, or some such name. But the invention belongs entirely to Eric, who built the first room of this kind under my eyes at the time of the rosy hours of Mazenderan. A decorative object, such as a column, for instance, was placed in one of the corners and immediately produced a hall of 1,000 columns. For, thanks to the mirrors, the real room was multiplied by 6 hexagonal rooms, each of which, in its turn, was multiplied indefinitely. But the little sultana soon tired of this childish illusion, whereupon Eric altered his invention into a torture chamber. For the architectural motive placed in one corner, he substituted an iron tree. This tree, with its painted leaves, was absolutely true to life, and was made of iron so as to resist all the attacks of the patient imprisoned in the torture chamber. We shall see how the scene thus obtained was twice altered into 2 successive other scenes, produced instantaneously by means of automatic rotation of the drums or rollers in the corners. These were divided into 3 sections, fitting into the angles of the mirrors, and each supporting a decorative scheme that came into sight as the roller revolved upon its axis. The walls of this strange room gave the patient nothing to lay hold of, because, apart from the solid decorative object, they were simply furnished with mirrors, thick enough to withstand any onslaught of the victim, who was flung into the chamber empty-handed and barefoot. There was no furniture, the ceiling was capable of being lit up. The ingenious system of electric heating, which has since been imitated, allowed the temperature of the walls and room to be increased at will. I am reciting all these details of a perfectly straightforward invention, giving, with the aid of a few painted branches, the supernatural illusion of an equatorial forest blazing under the tropical sun, so that no one may doubt the present balcony of my brain or feel entitled to say that I am mad or lying or that I take him for a fool. I now return to the facts where I left them. When the ceiling lit up and the forest became visible around us, the Viscount's stupefaction was immense. That impenetrable forest, with its innumerable trunks and branches, threw him into a terrible state of consternation. He passed his hands over his forehead, as though to drive away a dream. His eyes blinked, and for a moment he forgot to listen. I have already said that the sight of the forest did not surprise me at all, and therefore I listened for both of us to what was happening next door. Lastly, my attention was especially attracted not so much to the scene as to the mirrors that produced it. These mirrors were broken in parts. Yes, they were marked and scratched. They had been starred in spite of their solidity, and this proved to me that the torture chamber in which we now were had already served a purpose. Yes, some wretch, whose feet were not bare like those of the victims of the rosy hours of Mazenderan, had certainly fallen into this mortal illusion, and, mad with rage, had kicked against those mirrors which, nevertheless, continued to reflect his agony. And the branch of the tree on which he had put an end to his own sufferings was arranged in such a way that, before dying, he had seen, for his last consolation, 1,000 men writhing in his company. Yes, Joseph Boquet had been through all this. Were we to die as he had done? I did not think so, for I knew that we had a few hours before us, and that I could employ them to better purpose than Joseph Boquet was able to do. After all, I was thoroughly acquainted with most of Eric's tricks, and now or never was the time to turn my knowledge to account. To begin with, I abandoned any idea of returning to the passage which had brought us to that accursed chamber. I did not trouble about the possibility of working the inside stone that closed the passage, and this for the simple reason that to do so was out of the question. We had dropped from too great a height into the torture chamber. There was no furniture to help us reach the passage. Not even the branch of the iron tree, not even each other's shoulders were of any avail. There was only one possible outlet, that opening in the Louis Philippe room in which Eric and Christine Daae were. But through this outlet looked like just an ordinary door on their side. It was absolutely invisible to us. We must therefore try to open it without even knowing where it was. When I was quite sure that there was no hope for us from Christine Daae's side, when I had heard the monster dragging the poor girl from the Louis Philippe room, lest she should interfere with our tortures, I resolved to set to work without delay. But I was first to calm Monsieur de Chagny, who was already walking about like a madman, uttering incoherent cries. The snatches of conversation which he had caught between Christine and the monster had contributed not a little to drive him beside himself. Add to that the shock of the magic forest and the scorching heat which was beginning to make the perspiration stream down his temples, and you will have no difficulty in understanding his state of mind. He shouted Christine's name, brandished his pistol, knocked his forehead against the glass in his endeavors to rush down the glades of the elusive forest. In short, the torture was beginning to work its spell upon a brain unprepared for it. I did my best to induce the poor Viscount to listen to reason. I made him touch the mirrors and the iron tree and the branches, and explain to him, by optical laws, all the luminous imagery by which we were surrounded, and of which we need not allow ourselves to be the victims, like ordinary, ignorant people. We are in a room, a little room. That is what you must keep saying to yourself, and we shall leave the room as soon as we have found the door. And I promised him that, if he let me act without disturbing me by shouting and walking up and down, I would discover the trick of the door in less than an hour's time. Then he lay flat on the floor, as one does in a wood, and declared that he would wait until I found the door of the forest, as there was nothing better to do. And he added that, from where he was, the view was splendid. The torture was working, in spite of all that I had said. Myself, forgetting the forest, I tackled a glass panel and began to finger it in every direction, hunting for the spot which I must press in order to turn the door in accordance with Eric's system of pivots. This spot might be a mere speck on the glass, a speck no larger than a pea under which the spring lay hidden. I hunted and hunted. I felt as high as my hands could reach. Eric was about the same height as myself, and I considered that he would not have placed the spring higher than suited his stature. While groping over the successive panels with the greatest care, I endeavored not to lose a minute, for I was feeling more and more overcome with the heat, and we were literally roasting in that blazing forest. I had been working like this for half an hour and had finished 3 panels when, as ill luck would have it, I turned round on hearing a muttered exclamation from the Viscount. "I am stifling," he said. "All these mirrors are sending out an infernal heat. Do you think you will find that spring soon? If you are much longer about it, we shall be roasted alive." I was not sorry to hear him talk like this. He had not said a word of the forest, and I hoped that my company's reason would hold out for some time longer against the torture. But he added, "What consoles me is that the monster has given Christine until 11 tomorrow evening. If we can't get out of here and go to her assistance, at least we shall be dead before her. Then Eric's mask can serve for all of us." And he gulped down a breath of hot air that nearly made him faint. As I had not the same desperate reasons as Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny for accepting death, I returned to my panel after giving him a word of encouragement, but I had made the mistake of taking a few steps while speaking, and in the tangle of the elusive forest I was no longer able to make sure of the panel. I had to begin all over again at random, feeling, fumbling, groping. Now the fever laid hold of me in my turn, for I found nothing, absolutely nothing. In the next room all was silence. We were utterly lost in the forest, without an outlet, a compass, a guide, or anything. Oh, I knew what awaited us if nobody came to our aid, or if I did not find the spring. But, looking as I might, I found nothing but branches, beautiful branches that stood straight up before me or spread gracefully over my head. But they gave no shade, and this was natural enough, as we were in an equatorial forest, with the sun right above our heads, an African forest. Monsieur de Chagny and I had repeatedly taken off our coats and put them on again, finding at one time that they made us still hotter, and at another that they protected us against the heat. I continued to offer a moral resistance, but Monsieur de Chagny seemed to me quite gone. He pretended that he had been walking in that forest for 3 days and nights without stopping, looking for Christine Daae. From time to time, he thought he saw her behind the trunk of a tree, or gliding between the branches, and he called to her with words of supplication that brought the tears to my eyes. And then at last, "Oh, how thirsty I am!" he cried in delirious accents. I too was thirsty, my throat was on fire, and yet, squatting on the floor, I went on hunting for the spring of the invisible door, especially as it was dangerous to remain in the forest as evening drew nigh. Already the shades of night were beginning to surround us. It had happened very quickly. Night falls quickly in tropical countries, suddenly, with hardly any twilight. Now night in the forest of the equator is always dangerous, particularly when, like ourselves, one has not the materials for fire to keep off the beasts of prey. I did indeed try for a moment to break off the branches, which I would have lit with my dark lantern, but I knocked against the mirrors also and remembered, in time, that we had only images of branches to do with. The heat did not disappear with the daylight. On the contrary, it was now still hotter under the blue rays of the moon. I urged the Viscount to hold our weapons ready to fire and not to stray from camp while I went on looking for my spring. Suddenly, we heard a lion roar a few yards away. "Oh," whispered the Viscount. "He is quite close. Don't you see him? There, through the trees, in that thicket." "If he roars again, I will fire." And the roars were repeated, louder than before, and the Viscount fired, but I do not think that he hit the lion, only he smashed a mirror, as I perceived the next morning at daybreak. He must have covered a good distance during the night, for we suddenly found ourselves on the edge of the desert, an immense desert of sand, stones, and rocks. It was really not worth while leaving the forest to come upon the desert. Tired out, I flung myself down beside the Viscount, for I had enough of looking for springs which I could not find. I was quite surprised, and I said to the Viscount that we had encountered no other dangerous animals during the night. Usually, after the lion came, the leopard, and sometimes the buzz of the tsetse fly. These effects were easily obtained, and I explained to Monsieur de Cheny how Eric imitated the roar of a lion on a long tabor or timbrel, with an ass's skin at one end. Over this skin he tied a string of catgut, which was fastened at the middle to another similar string passing through the whole length of the tabor. Eric had only to rub this string with a glove smeared with resin, and according to the manner on which he rubbed it, he imitated to perfection the voice of the lion or the leopard, or even the buzzing of the tsetse fly. The idea that Eric was probably in the room beside us, working his trick, made me suddenly resolve to enter into a parley with him, for we must obviously give up thought of taking him by surprise, and by this time he must be quite aware who we were, the occupants of his torture chamber. I called him. "Eric! Eric!" I shouted as loud as I could across the desert, but there was no answer to my voice. All around us lay the silence and the bare immensity of that stony desert. What was to become of us in the midst of that awful solitude? We were beginning literally to die of heat, hunger, and thirst. Of thirst especially. At last I saw Monsieur de Cheny raise himself on his elbow and point to a spot on the horizon. He had discovered an oasis. Yes, far in the distance was an oasis with limpid water which reflected the iron tree. Tush, it was the scene of the mirage. I recognized it at once. The worst of all the three scenes. No one had been able to fight against it. No one. I did my utmost to keep my head and not hope for water, because I knew that, if a man hoped for water, the water that reflected the iron tree, and if, after hoping for water, he struck against the mirror, then there was but one thing for him to do: to hang himself on the iron tree. So I cried to Monsieur de Cheny, "It's the mirage! It's the mirage! Don't believe in the water! It's another trick of the mirrors." Then he flatly told me to shut up, with my tricks of the mirrors, my springs, my revolving doors, and my places of illusion. He angrily declared that I must be either blind or mad to imagine that all that water flowing over there, among those countless splendid trees, was not real water. And the desert was real, and so was the forest, and it was no use trying to take him in. He was an old, experienced traveler. He had been all over the place. And he dragged himself along, saying, "Water, water!" And his mouth was open, as though he were drinking. And my mouth was open too, as though I were drinking. For we not only saw the water, but we heard it. We heard it flow, we heard it ripple. Do you understand that word ripple? It is a sound which you hear with your tongue. You put your tongue out of your mouth to listen to it better. Lastly, and this was the most pitiless torture of all, we heard the rain. And it was not raining. This was an infernal device. Oh, I knew well enough how Eric obtained it. He filled with little stones a very long and narrow box, broken up inside with wooden and metal projections. The stones, in falling, struck against these projections and rebounded from one to the other, and the result was a series of pattering sounds, exactly like a rainstorm. Ugh! You should have seen us putting out our tongues and dragging ourselves towards the rippling river bank. Our eyes and ears were full of water, but our tongues were hard and dry as horn. When we reached the mirror, Monsieur de Cheny licked it, and I also licked the glass. It was burning hot. Then we rolled on the floor with a hoarse cry of despair. Monsieur de Cheny put the one pistol that was still loaded to his temple, and I stared at the Punjab lasso at the foot of the iron tree. I knew why the iron tree had returned in this third change of scene. The iron tree was waiting for me. But as I stared at the Punjab lasso, I saw a thing that made me start so violently that Monsieur de Cheny delayed his attempt at suicide. I seized him by the arm, and then I caught the pistol from him, and then I dragged myself on my knees towards what I had seen. I had discovered, near the Punjab lasso, in a groove in the floor, a black-headed nail whose use I knew. At last, I had found the spring. I felt the nail. I lifted a radiant face to Monsieur de Cheny. The black-headed nail yielded to my pressure. And then we saw, not a door opening to the wall, but a cellar flap released in the floor. Cool air came up to us from the black hole below. We stood over that square of darkness as though over a limpid well. With our chins in the cool shade, we drank it in. And we bent lower and lower over the trap door. What could there be in that cellar which opened before us? Water? Water to drink? I thrust my arm into the darkness and came upon a stone and another stone. A staircase. A dark staircase leading into the cellar. The Viscount wanted to fling himself down the hole, but I, fearing a new trick of the monsters, stopped him, turned on my dark lantern, and went down first. The staircase was a winding one, and led down into a pitchy darkness. But oh, how deliciously cool were the darkness and the stairs. The lake could not be far away. We soon reached the bottom. Our eyes were beginning to accustom themselves to the dark, to distinguish shapes around us. Circular shapes, on which I turned the light of my lantern. Barrels! We were in Eric's cellar. It was here that he must keep his wine, and perhaps his drinking water. I knew that Eric was a great lover of good wine. Ah, there was plenty to drink here. Monsieur de Cheny patted the round shapes and kept on saying, "Barrels! Barrels! What a lot of barrels!" Indeed, there was quite a number of them, symmetrically arranged in 2 rows, one on either side of us. They were small barrels, and I thought that Eric must have selected them of that size to facilitate their carriage to the house on the lake. We examined them successively to see if one of them had not a funnel, showing that it had been tapped at some time or another, but all the barrels were hermetically closed. Then, after half lifting one to make sure that it was full, we went on our knees, and with the blade of a small knife, which I carried, I prepared to stave in the bung-hole. At that moment, I seemed to hear, coming from very far, a sort of monotonous chant which I knew well, for I had very often heard it in the streets of Paris. Barrels, barrels, any barrels to sell? My hand desisted from its work. Monsieur de Chagny had also heard. He said, "That's funny. It sounds as if the barrel was singing." The song was repeated farther away. Barrels, barrels, any barrels to sell? Oh, said the Viscount, I swear the tune is dying away inside the barrel. We stood up and went to look behind the barrel. It's inside, said Monsieur de Chagny. It's inside. But we heard no more, and were driven to accuse the disturbed condition of our senses, and we returned to the bung-hole. Monsieur de Chagny put his 2 hands together underneath it, and, with a last effort, I burst the bung. What's this? Cried the Viscount. This isn't water. The Viscount put his 2 full hands close to my lantern. I stopped to look, and at the same moment flung away my lantern with such violence that it broke and went out, leaving us in utter darkness. What I had seen in Monsieur de Chagny's hands was gunpowder. That was the end of chapter 14. Woo! Gunpowder in barrels. I'm assuming that is for if at 11 p.m. Christine Daae chooses the Requiem Mass and not the Marriage Mass. Do you know what I mean? A big boom. Yes. Okay, I took forever on the recap, so it's already a 37-minute video. But we are going to do chapter 15 because I'm determined and excited. Chapter 15. Which shall she turn? The Persian's narrative concluded. The discovery flung us into a state of alarm that made us forget all our past and present sufferings. We now knew what the monster meant to convey when he said to Christine Daae, yes or no. If your answer is no, everybody will be dead and buried. I was right. A big boom. Yes, buried under the ruins of the Paris Opera House. The monster had given her until 11 o'clock in the evening. He had chosen his time well. There would be many people up there, many of the human race, in the brilliant theater. What finer attendance could he expect at his funeral? He would go down to the tomb, escorted by the widest shoulders in the world, decked with the richest jewels. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. We were all to be blown up in the middle of the performance if Christine Daae said no. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. And what else could Christine say but no? Would she not prefer to espouse death itself rather than that living corpse? She did not know that on her acceptance or refusal depended the awful fate of many members of the human race. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. And we dragged ourselves through the darkness, feeling our way to the stone steps, for the light in the trap-door overhead that led to the room of mirrors was now extinguished, and we repeated to ourselves, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. At last I found the staircase. But suddenly, I drew myself up on the first step with a terrible thought that came to my mind. What is the time? Yes, what was the time? For after all, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening might be now, might be this very moment. Who could tell us the time? We seem to have been imprisoned in that hell for days and days, for years, since the beginning of the world. Perhaps we should be blown up then and there. Ah, a sound, a crack. Did you hear that? There in the corner. Good heavens. Like the sound of a machinery. Again. Oh, the light. Perhaps it's the machinery that is to blow everything up. I tell you, a cracking sound. Are you deaf? Monsieur de Chagny and I began to yell like madmen. fear spurred us on. We rushed up the street, up the treads of the staircase, stumbling as we went, anything to escape the dark, to turn to the mortal light of the room of mirrors. We found the trapdoor still open, but it was now as dark in the room of mirrors as in the cellar which we had left. We dragged ourselves along the floor of the torture chamber. The floor between us and the powder magazine. That was the time? Oh, no, what was the time? We shouted, we called out, Monsieur de Cheney to Christine, I to Eric. I reminded him that I had saved his life, but no answer, save the echoing cry of our despair, our madness. What was the time? We argued, we tried to calculate the time which we had spent there, but we were incapable of reasoning. If only we could see the face of a watch. Mine had stopped, but Monsieur de Cheney's was still going. He told me that he had wound it up before dressing for the opera. We had not a match upon us, and yet we must know. Monsieur de Cheney broke the glass in his watch and felt the two hands. He questioned the hands of the watch with his fingertips, going by the position of the ring of the watch. Judging by the space between the hands, he thought it might be just 11 o'clock. But perhaps it was not 11 o'clock of which we stood in dread. Perhaps we had still 12 hours before us. Suddenly I exclaimed, Hush! I thought I heard footsteps in the next room. Someone tapped against the wall. Christine Daae's voice said, Raoul! Raoul! We now all began to talk at once, on either side of the wall. Christine sobbed. She had not felt sure that she would find Monsieur de Cheney alive. The monster had been terrible. It seemed had done nothing but rave, waiting for her to give him the yes, which she refused. And yet she had promised him that yes, if he would take her to the torture chamber. But he had obstinately declined, and had uttered hideous threats against all the members of the human race. At last, after hours and hours of that hell, he had this moment gone out, leaving her alone to reflect for the last time. Hours and hours? What is the time now? What is the time, Christine? It's 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock, all but 5 minutes. But which 11 o'clock? The 11 o'clock that is to decide life or death. He told me so before he went. He is terrible. He is quite mad. He tore off his mask, and his yellow eyes shot flames. He did nothing but laugh. He said, 5 minutes. I leave you alone to spare your blushes. Here, he said, taking the key from the little bag of life and death. Here is the little bronze key that opens the 2 ebony casks on the mantelpiece in the Louis Philippe room. In one of the caskets, you will find a scorpion, in the other a grasshopper. Both are very cleverly done in Japanese bronze. They will say yes or no for you. If you turn the scorpion, I shall understand when I come back that you have said yes. The grasshopper will mean no. And he laughed like a drunken demon. If I did nothing but beg and entreat him to give me the key of the torture chamber, promising to be his wife if he granted me this request. But he told me that there was no further need for that key, and that he was going to throw it into the lake. And he again laughed like a drunken demon, and left me. Oh, his last words were, The grasshopper! Mind the grasshopper! The grasshopper not only turns, it hops! It hops! It hops jolly high! The 5 minutes had nearly elapsed, and the scorpion and the grasshopper were scratching at my brain. Nevertheless, I had sufficient lucidity left to understand that if the grasshopper were turned, it would hop, and with it many members of the race. There was no doubt that the grasshopper controlled an electric current intended to blow up the powder magazine. Monsieur de Cheney, who seemed to have recovered all his strength of mind at hearing Christine's voice, explained to her in a few hurried words the situation in which he and the opera were. He told her in turn the scorpion at once. He told her to turn the scorpion at once. There was a pause. Christine, I cried, where are you? By the scorpion. Don't touch it. The idea had come to me, for I knew my Eric, that the monster had perhaps deceived the girl once more. Perhaps it was the scorpion that would blow everything up. After all, why wasn't he there? The 5 minutes were long past, and he was not back. Perhaps he had taken shelter and was waiting for the explosion. Why had he not returned? He could not really expect Christine ever to consent to become his voluntary prey. Why had he not returned? "Don't touch the scorpion," I said. "Here he comes," cried Christine. "I hear him. Here he is." We heard his steps approaching the Louis Philippe room. He came up to Christine, but did not speak. Then I raised my voice. "Eric, it is I. Do you know me?" With extraordinary calmness, he at once replied, "So, you are not dead in there? Well, then, keep quiet." I tried to speak, but he said coldly, "Not a word, Daroga, or I shall blow everything up." And he added, "The honor rests with Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle has not touched the scorpion." How deliberately he spoke. "Mademoiselle has not touched the grasshopper." With what composure. But it is not too late to do the right thing. There, I open the caskets without a key, for I am a trapdoor lover, and I open and shut what I please, and as I please. I open the little ebony caskets. Mademoiselle, look at the little dears inside. Aren't they pretty? If you turn the grasshopper, mademoiselle, we shall all be blown up. There is enough gunpowder under our feet to blow up a whole section of Paris. If you turn the scorpion, mademoiselle, all that powder will be soaked and drowned. Mademoiselle, to celebrate our wedding, you shall make a very handsome present to a few hundred Parisians who are at this moment applauding a poor masterpiece of Meyerbeer beers, and you shall make them a present of their lives. For with your own fair hands you shall turn the scorpion. And merrily, merrily, we will be married. A pause, and then, if, in 2 minutes, mademoiselle, you have not turned the scorpion, I shall turn the grasshopper, and the grasshopper, I tell you, hops jolly high. The terrible silence began anew. The Vicomte de Chagny, realizing that there was nothing left to do but pray, went down on his knees and prayed. As for me, my blood beat so fiercely that I had to take my heart in both my hands, lest it should burst. At last, we heard Eric's voice. The 2 minutes are past. Goodbye, mademoiselle. Hop, grasshopper. Eric, cried Christine, do you swear to me, monster, do you swear to me that the scorpion is the one to turn? Yes, to hop at our wedding. You see, I said to hop. At our wedding, ingenious child, the scorpion opens the ball. But that will do. You won't have the scorpion. Then I turn the grasshopper. Eric, enough! I was crying out in concert with Christine. Monsieur de Chagny was still on his knees, praying. Eric, I have turned the scorpion. Oh, the second through which we passed, waiting to find ourselves in fragments amid the roar and the ruins, feeling something crack beneath our feet, hearing an appealing hiss through the open trap door, a hiss like the first sound of a rocket. It came softly at first, then louder, then very loud. But it was not the hiss of fire. It was more like the hiss of water, and now it became a gurgling sound. Guggle, guggle. We rushed to the trap door. All our thirst, which had vanished when the terror came, now returned with the lapping of the water. The water rose in the cellar, above the barrels, the powder barrels. Barrels, barrels. Any barrels to sell? And we went down to it with parched throats. It rose to our chins, to our mouths, and we drank. We stood on the floor of the cellar, and we drank. And we went up the stairs again in the dark, step by step, went up with the water. The water came out of the cellar with us and spread over the floor of the room. If this went on, the whole house on the lake would be swamped. The floor of the torture chamber had itself become a regular little lake, in which our feet splashed. Surely there was water enough now. Eric must turn off the tap. Eric! Eric! There's water enough for the gunpowder. Turn off the tap. Turn off the scorpion. But Eric did not reply. He heard nothing but the water rising. We heard nothing but the water rising. It was halfway up to our waist. Christine, cried Monsieur de Cheny. Christine, the water is up to our knees. But Christine did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. No one in the next room, no one to turn the tap, no one to turn the scorpion. We were all alone in the dark with the dark water that seized us and clasped us and froze us. Eric! Eric! Christine! Christine! By this time we had lost our foothold and were spinning round in the water, carried away by an irresistible whirl, for the water turned with us and dashed us against the dark mirrors, which thrust us back again, and our throats, raised above the whirlpool, roared aloud. We were to die here, drowned in the torture chamber? I had never seen that. Eric, at the time of the rosy hours of Mazenderan, had never shown me that, through a little invisible window. Eric! Eric! I cried. I saved your life! Remember? You were sentenced to death, but for me, you would be dead now. Eric! We whirled round in the water like so much wreckage, but suddenly my straying hand seized the trunk of the iron tree. I called Monsieur de Cheny, and we both clung to the branch of the iron tree, and the water rose still higher. Oh, can you remember how much space is there between the branch and the tree and the dome-shaped ceiling? Do try to remember. After all, the water may stop. It must find its level. There. I think it is stopping. Oh no. Oh, horrible. Swim! Swim for your life! Our arms became entangled in the effort of swimming. We choked. We struggled in the dark water. Already we could hardly breathe the dark air above the dark water. And the air which escaped, which we could hear escape through some vent hole or other. Oh, let us turn and turn until we find the air hole, and then glue our mouths to it. But I lost my strength. I tried to lay hold of the walls. Oh, how those glass walls slipped under my groping fingers. We whirled round again. We began to sink. One last effort, a last cry. Eric! Christine! Guggle, guggle, guggle in our ears. Guggle, guggle at the bottom of the dark water. Our ears went guggle, guggle. And before losing consciousness entirely, I seemed to hear between two gurgles. Barrels, barrels. Any barrels to sell? That's the end of chapter 25. My goodness. Are they gonna make it? That's wild. So we just have a chapter left with the epilogue. And I am, I think, gonna read the epilogue. I can't believe it. So dramatic. Okay. Readers and people out there in the wild, until next time, I bid you adieu.